I've had the good fortune in my many years in Congress to travel many places in the world and seen some very, very economically depressed areas. But Afghanistan is the topper. During my trip to Afghanistan, I met with general officers. I met with troops. They're fighting on the front lines every day. But during my meetings with the generals and the troops, they reinforced to me their courage and determination to win the fight against the Taliban and the terrorists. The courage of our troops and the Afghan people was really inspiring to me. But I was reminded of the difference the United States has made by aiding the fight against this Taliban. But there was another conclusion you can't avoid if you go to Afghanistan. The progress I saw is being undermined by a security situation that is deteriorating day by day. I returned home more convinced than ever that the greatest threat to our national security lies in Pakistan and Afghanistan. And these places must be our central focus on the war on terror. Today, one day from the 7th anniversary of the most violent terrorist attack ever to take place on American soil, the mastermind of the attack, Osama bin Laden, is still free. For all the tough rhetoric of the Bush administration of chasing bin Laden to the gates of hell, he's been joined in that by Senator McCain. The Bush administration has failed to put the necessary resources and manpower into the hunt for America's #1 enemy. Remember, we were trapped at one time in the place we call Tora Bora. But our eye was taken off that, and troops were pulled out of Afghanistan and to the war, the unnecessary war in Iraq. President Bush has rightly said the war on terror is about more than just one man. Yet 7 years after 9/11, the president allowed that group called Qaedea to regroup in its safe haven in Pakistan. And in Afghanistan, the sad fact is that the Taliban, the brutally oppressive regime that housed bin Laden and al-Qaeda, is on the rise, attacking our troops, innocent Afghan civilians. So we must be clear-eyed in our realization that the very same people who attacked us then continue to strengthen and threaten us now. The dire situation could have been avoided. When President Bush took us to Afghanistan following 9/11, Democrats, our country, and the world stood with him. We knew it was a fight that we must wage and we must win. But after a series of military victories, the president lost focus and turned instead to an ill-conceived war in Iraq. With the job unfinished in Afghanistan, the president devoted our troops and treasure to another battlefield. Predictably, with the focus shifted, the Afghan people joining with us found no one at their side. The progress in Afghanistan began to go backwards, with neighborhoods once reclaimed from the enemy becoming battlegrounds once again. The reason for these failures is no mystery. No matter how hard the Republican spin machine tries to rewrite history and obscure the truth, the fact is that the terrorists who attacked us on 9/11 were in Afghanistan, not in Iraq. As much as we're glad to get rid of Saddam Hussein, and we all are, during his reign, and that's what it was in Iraq, there were no terrorists there. Afghanistan is a far larger country than Iraq, larger population, far, far more difficult terrain. Yet today we have about 34,000 American troops in Afghanistan and about 150,000 in Iraq. Afghanistan is the home of al-Qaeda, the home of the Taliban, the central front of the war on terror. Yet there are 4.5 times as many troops in Iraq, and we spent huge amounts more money in Iraq than Afghanistan. The result of this Republican failure, led by President Bush, is clear. After dropping violence early in the Afghan war, the Taliban came back with a vengeance in mid-2006. By that time, we didn't have enough troops on the ground to respond. The troops were 1,500 miles away. Now, Mr. President, this isn't just Harry Reid up here giving an anti-Bush speech. The commander of American forces in the region, the #1 man, Admiral William Fallon, put it this way in January of this year. I quote, "Back in 2001 and early 2002, the Taliban were pretty much vanquished." That's just what I've said. He continued, "But my sense looking back is that we moved focus to Iraq, which was the priority from 2003 on, and the attention and the resources focused on a different place," end of quote. Mr. President, that is what Admiral Fallon said, and that's what I have said in my remarks prior to his quote. With resources focused on a different place, as Admiral Fallon said, here's what we're now saying. In July, nearly twice as many U.S. troops were killed in Afghanistan as in Iraq. In June, it was the second deadliest month in Afghanistan for coalition U.S. forces since the start of the war. In eastern Afghanistan, attacks on coalition troops increased by more than 40% over the first 5 months of the year. Roadside bombings have increased. The opium production is up. Mr. President, 93% of all the world's opium is produced in Afghanistan. We've got to do better than that. 93% of the world's opium is produced in one country. President Bush's failures in Iraq and Afghanistan have had consequences beyond the borders of those two countries. This morning, the Bipartisan American Security Project issued a report noting that attacks by violent terrorist groups around the world are at an all-time high. And this is without the terrorist attacks in Afghanistan and Iraq. Their report also notes that ungoverned spaces continue to provide sanctuary for terrorist organizations, including Afghanistan, East and North Africa, and Somalia. Yesterday, President Bush had one last chance to meaningfully change his strategy and begin to reverse all these backsliding trends. But he chose not to do so. He chose to stick with the status quo and not make the significant changes that were necessary. And unfortunately, we've seen no reason to believe that a John McCain presidency would offer any break from the failed Bush foreign policy. For all his talk about listening to the commanders on the ground, George Bush and John McCain are dangerously deaf to the calls of our commanders in Afghanistan. Listen to what Admiral Mullen further said. I quote, "I have made no secret of my desire to flow more forces, U.S. forces, to Afghanistan just as soon as I can, nor have I been shy about saying that. These forces will not be available unless or until the situation in Iraq permits us to do so." So we know today, Mr. President, that no more than a token shift of troop levels will take place until we have a new president. A new president committed to winning the war on terror by fighting the actual terrorists. Not creating war, but winning war. That will require a new approach to Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. We've seen in Pakistan a dangerous approach by this administration, placing all our bets on one man, General Musharraf. And it was a fatal and unavoidable, and certainly an unavoidable blunder. Musharraf didn't implement democracy, he didn't uphold human rights, didn't stop the terrorists operating inside Pakistan borders, he fired all the judges. American dollars meant to fight terrorism were wasted. The Pakistani people suffered, and the United States lost credibility with him for supporting a dictator who did not want to uphold basic human rights. Because of President Bush's failed approach to Pakistan, we now have seen al-Qaeda regroup within its borders. According to the declassified key judgments, the National Intelligence Estimate of July 2007, entitled "The Terrorist Threat to the U.S. Homeland," al-Qaeda has, and I quote, "protected or regenerated key elements of its homeland attack capability, including a safe haven in the Pakistani federal administered tribal areas." The intelligence agency reiterated this a few weeks ago, saying that al-Qaeda, and I quote, "has maintained or strengthened key elements of its capability to attack the United States in the past year." During our time in Afghanistan, from our meetings with President Karzai to our meetings with American generals, one message was clear: we cannot solve the problem in Afghanistan without solving the problem in Pakistan. Those concerned with the writing of our history books will have ample opportunity to delve into the Bush failures in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan in far greater detail than I've done in these brief remarks.